Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this semester's Beto Chair Lecture Series. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jesenia Pizarro. She is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice in Arizona State University. Her research is transdisciplinary in nature and focuses on the proximal events and situational factors that result in violence, the processing of violent crime in the criminal justice system, and anti-violence strategies. Her research also explores correctional practices in the United States. Dr. Pizarro is a board member of the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms and the Homicide Research Working Group. She has worked with police departments and agencies throughout the country in joint efforts to curb violence and has managed federally funded grants that focus on urban violence and intimate partner homicide prevention, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation in various capacities and roles. She currently serves as the editor-in-chief of Homicide Studies, an interdisciplinary and international journal. Welcome, Dr. Pizarro.
This is my first time using one of these. Can you hear me? And so hopefully I don't fumble the fancy equipment. So thank you all for having me, and it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be invited. So I am very excited to talk to you about my work, and I'm going to take you on a journey today of why I do what I do and a little showcase of some of the work that I have done in the past 20, 25 years. But before we go into that, I want to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about firearm-related harms. And what do we mean by firearm-related harm? Firearm-related harm encompasses things like gunshot wounds, people who are shot, either self-inflicted, to accidental deaths. It also encompasses the aftermath of these of what happens after being exposed to firearm violence or having to use a firearm in self-defense. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm focusing only on the more active being shot type of information. So approximately in the United States, approximately 90,000 people are shot every year. And for people that don't study this, sometimes it is a shock, right? So approximately 90,000 people are shot every year. Of those, about half of them lose their life. So we have about 45,000 deaths due to a firearm every year. When we talk about firearm mortality, firearm is the leading cause of death for children and teens in this country. It's also one of the top 5 top causes of death in the country overall. Until very recently, it was accidental, suicide, homicide. Now, homicide is in 4th place. But this just happened this year. So if you look at firearm mortality, the bulk of it are suicide cases. So we have about 30,000 people die by firearm suicide, and about 20,000 people die due to a firearm related type of other type of violence. Either the CDC classify it suicide, homicide, and then you have unintentional, which are accidents, and then you have legal interventions, which are usually police shootings. We reached an all-time high in firearm deaths in 2021, with close to 51,000 people dying as a result of this. And the numbers have trended down, particularly with homicide, but have remained at a trending up level with suicide. We also know, based on a report that was put out by the by our Surgeon General from the previous administration and surveys that have been done, that approximately 54% of Americans report to have experienced some type of firearm-related incident, be it witnessing it, having been threatened with a firearm, having somebody that they love being shot, or knowing someone who has died. So this is a problem that affects Americans overall. Even though some types of firearm violence will concentrate in some areas. So for example, when we talk about homicide, it is most likely to affect, it's an issue in urban areas. It affects Black and brown individuals. When we talk about suicide, it's an issue that is more prevalent with white males, although we have seen sharp increases in the African American population in the past 5 or 6 years. We're starting to see more Black men dying from gunshot suicides. But this is an issue that affects everyone. And of course, I'm not going to talk here about school shootings and stuff, but we see that this is something that touches every aspect of the American life. When we just look at the statistics, approximately 80%, and if you want a precise number, 79% of all homicides are committed with a firearm, 55% of suicide, 40% of robberies, about a quarter of all assaults involve a firearm. And we also know that the risk of death, if there is a firearm, or that the risk of an incident, a violent incident escalating, increases if there's a firearm. If you're shot, the odds of lethality are higher, even if it's like a regular bar fight. If you're shot, you're more likely to die. And we know that in suicide cases, if you use a firearm, 97% of the time, you're going to be effective in your goal to kill yourself. So it's overrepresented, and we see it in our crime, and we see it with our self-inflicted type of crimes. And even if we wanted to look at accidental deaths, and when we talk about children, you see an overrepresentation there as well. So what are the risk factors? Why do people have firearms? So according to the latest Gallup polls, the number one reason that people give for having a firearm and for having a firearm unlocked in the home is self-protection. But do they really serve as a self-protective factor? Well, we know from the literature that higher access to firearm, when combined with things like poor social structural conditions, community violence, living in a place that already has high rates of violence, perceptions of police bias and perceptions that when communities do not trust the police, things like substance abuse, drug use, a history of mental illness, having peers that carry firearms, and prior criminal involvement, we know that increases the odds of you either using a firearm against someone or against yourself. So we know there are some risk factors, and I must add here that a lot of this information on risk factors, a lot of it comes from public health perspective, which is going to give you my quest as a criminologist to study this. So people, when I tell people what I do, people are usually shocked. And they're like, you seem so happy. Why do you do what you do? And so I always get the question, why firearms? Why homicide? So I started my career as a homicide researcher. And I didn't really call myself, it wasn't really a thing to be a firearm researcher until 5 years ago. And there's a whole history on that, why there wasn't really a field of study. But I was always a homicide researcher. And why do I do that? So a little bit about myself. I am from Newark, New Jersey. Do any of you know where Newark, New Jersey is? Newark, New Jersey. So I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, or Brick City. It's called Brick City because of the high volume at the time when I was growing up of high-rise public housing. So that's where I grew up. I don't have the traditional background as as a lot of my peers, right? I grew up in the projects. My parents were system involved. My father was going in and out of prison for doing bad stuff. So that's what I grew up seeing. So I grew up living in the projects, and I must add that this was in the 80s and the early 90s. So this was during the height of the crack epidemic in the country. So homicide was really high. So I remember growing up as a child, people getting shot. I remember seeing things that I perceived were injustices by the criminal justice system. I remember all kinds of stuff, right? I remember that if there was a fight and you had to call the police and be like, oh, there's a couple people got shot or something. So I remember all of that. And growing up as a child, I wanted to do something about it. So when people were, a lot of my friends my age were playing, they would play like teacher. I always wanted to be a cop. And then eventually I said I wanted to be a judge because I wanted to put people away. So that was my whole thing, right? I wanted to be a judge. I'm going to clean up the streets. I'm going to send everybody to prison. So if you're an abolitionist, cover your eyes, cover your ears. But this was my goal all the way through high school and all the way till I went to undergrad. I obviously abandoned my goal of being a judge to put people in prison. But that was what 18-year-old Jessie was doing. So those experiences shaped what I do. So when I came into academia, as somebody with the background I came with this goal of doing stuff to help my community. And a lot of my early work focuses on Newark and helping my community. So I always wanted to do work that meant something. I didn't really understand the academic thing of like publishing in nice journals and all that stuff. That a lot of that stuff was foreign to me. What I wanted to do was work in the field and help clean up Newark and similar communities. So that led me to the approach that I currently employ. I went to school at Rutgers at the time where I would argue it was like the mecca for situational crime prevention, routine activities, rational choice theory. So when I was there, that was when George Kelling was there, Broken Windows, Ron Clark, the late Ron Clark was there with rational choice, Marcus Felsen with routine activities. So these were my professors. And I actually was assigned to work with George Kelling, and he was my major mentor through the time. And when I went to them with dissertation ideas, I went with the traditional, I want to do a study on homicide and then look at structural conditions. And I remember Ron Clark looked at me, he was like, you're not going to find anything interesting. And if once you find it's poverty, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to eradicate poverty in Newark? And I was like, no. So they were like the ones that pushed me to do, why don't you do something more situational? And that set me in the path that I am today. So it was this whole, by chance of being at Rutgers at the time, but it was also my passion of trying to do something to better Newark. And then I was like, oh, we could do situational crime prevention for violence. Let's try it. So when we talk about my work, that has influenced the way I have approached my research. And I started with a lot of my research looking at, and it wasn't necessarily firearm violence, it was homicide. And looking at why are people doing this from a situational approach. And I published multiple things, you're not gonna see it, but a lot of it is homicide specific, where we look at the situational dynamics of it. Now, I was very fortunate in working with George Kelling, that at the time he brought me in as his research assistant, he had a PSN grant, Project Safe Neighborhoods grant, in Newark. And as part of that, he assigned me to go and collect homicide data. And I used that data for my dissertation. And then I was very fortunate enough, he was like, look, after I finished, he was like, I'm not gonna publish with this, take the data and do whatever you want with it. And I was like, not many mentors let you take their data. I pretty much took the data and made a career of it throughout it. Today, I want to talk to you about a specific study because one of the things that I was encountering a lot in my research is that I only had access to dead people. And of course, the big criticism that was correct at the time was like, well, you don't have non-dead people. So how are you making predictions or how are you really understanding this? So I had the fortune to team up with one of my colleagues, Kristen Segoba, who's now at Florida International University, but at the time she was the head of research in the New Jersey Department of Corrections. And we teamed up and did this study where we looked at, well, the goal was I wanted to examine why, what are some of the factors that influence if a firearm is used. So these were like the same, like some research questions and hypotheses, and we got a sample of 375 incarcerated people that were in prison for a violent offense, and then we looked at their entire record. And one of the things that I always tell people, and you guys will know this as a place that a lot of corrections research happens, is that the gold standard is getting somebody's pre-sentence investigation report. It has everything from like what happened when they were 5 years old to what happened the week before they came to prison. So we had access to the pre-sentence investigation reports, full criminal history, not just what was happening in New Jersey, other states. We had the incident report and the court documents that were used in trial. We had behavioral assessments. And another thing that wasn't used in this study, we had a sample of interviews with these offenders. So we use this data, and this is really small, but the whole idea and the gist of it, we coded the data for like, was this a premeditated offense? Was it a spontaneous offense? What were some motives? And we eventually grouped motives, but one of the motives was to take something that was not theirs. The other was we labeled it humiliation or escalation of a dispute. And then they were like just the sadistic pedophiles that were in the sample that they were like one of the people, it was his birthday and he wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. So he just went and killed someone at the park. So there's like no rhyme or reason. Cut short, what we did find, and I forgot to mention, a lot of this was based on, I went in looking at it from a rational choice perspective. And as we suspected, premeditation was a big predictor of whether you use a homicide. So if you were planning to kill someone, if you wanted to inflict harm, you're more likely to bring a gun. We also found that motive was important. So humiliation and resolving conflict were more likely to use a firearm. And then, of course, pedophilia, sadism, where you just wanted to like hurt someone and kind of enjoy the hurting someone, that was less likely to involve a gun. There were other things that, for the sake of time, I'm not really going to go into. But like the whole big thing was that offender premeditation, motivation did influence whether you're going to use a firearm, and incidents that were more instrumental in nature were more likely to use a firearm. Not that I'm going to discuss about it here, but in another study I did with just homicide, I did find that even though, yes, they're more likely to be used in premeditated type of violence, and this was a sample of everything from robbery to rape. So this was a full violence. But in some of my homicide-related research, I also find that simply carrying a gun escalates the crime. So when I looked at another study with Carissa Pelletier that was published in, I think, 2021, we found that about 55% of the time the offender went to the location thinking, I'm going to confront this person and kill them. But still, like about 40% of the cases, just having the gun escalated the dispute into where a firearm was used. So that's a little bit of my crim research. I took that to mean that it did support rational choice theory, and we could get into the whole debate about rational choice theory, because people will say, like, is it really rational? Well, according to Ron Clark, it's rational if it's rational to the offender. So it's not like, it's not our rationality, it's whatever is rational to them. I'm sure there'll be questions about this and we could discuss them in the Q&A. So that was a little showcase of my criminology work. I then ventured into criminal justice research, and this is a school of criminal justice. I came from a school of criminal justice, which was Rutgers. And prior to this, I was at Michigan State, which is a school of criminal justice. Right now, I'm in a school of criminology and criminal justice. And maybe things have changed, but I don't know if you get the sense that some people that do criminology like to look down at people that do criminal justice. There's a reason why criminology is number one versus more your practitioner, police practice and research and all that stuff, right? So my husband, we have a running joke in the house that my husband does strictly criminal justice research. And I always say we married criminology and criminal justice because I started as just a criminology person. But I started venturing into some of the more criminal justice related research, and I was interested, and this work was not mostly focused on firearms, but I was interested in two things. I wanted to know how homicides in particular go through the system, and in doing that, I wanted to look at the effect of clearance, and I wanted to look at how it went through the courts. In my clearance work, that's my own. I have one publication with my husband, and he's in that clearance thing, in that clearance paper with me, because I had to learn a little bit of policing to do it. And so these are just about factors that affect clearance and how cases are processed and how they go through the system. So the first study, we looked at clearance. Clearance is important. We know that approximately 60%, that number could be a little lower now. Almost half of all cases are not cleared. So talk about getting away with murder, and it varies by places. I have worked in police departments that they have 80% clearance rates, and I have worked in police departments that have had 20% clearance rate. Actually, I'm going to divert a little and give you a funny story. I work in undisclosed police department. I go in, and the first time I'm talking to them, and we're going to collect homicide, and I'm like, well, what's your clearance rate? And the head lieutenant very convincingly says, 100%. And I was like, have a 100% clearance rate? He was like, 100%, yes. It's not our fault the prosecutor doesn't want to prosecute them. And I was like, that is not your clearance rate. I wanted to say, like, no, your clearance rate is more like 20 or 18%, but according to that lieutenant, it was 100%, and he was convinced about it, and it was the prosecutor's fault that wasn't bringing charges against the people. But anyway, so one of the things that we know that is in the past 40, 50 years, clearance have been decreasing significantly. But at the same time, the usage of firearms have been increasing significantly. So we went from a time where we were nationally clearing about 90% of cases to now that it's almost half. So in this case, we built a database of every homicide in Rochester, New York. And we got lucky because we were able to do like a natural experiment, because during the data collection, they had revamped their entire investigation system and their process. So, but that's not part of the firearm stuff. That's something else if we want to talk about homicide clearance and all that. But what I want to bring your attention here is that even with a revamped police department investigation strategy, cases that involved a firearm were less likely to be cleared, right? And this is the moment that if I'm teaching my class, I'll ask, like, why do you think that is, right? But a lot of it has to do with there's less physical evidence left behind the scene. You don't have that close contact, so you're probably not going to have a lot of witnesses. And sometimes these cases involve individuals that are in the criminal underworld, gang members, drug dealers and stuff. So you're not going to have a lot of people coming forward and because of their own fear to talk about this. So in the clearance world, when you're investigating homicides, when you're investigating violence, these are harder cases to close. So I always get into it with people. They're like, oh, cops are not doing their job. And this is where I was like, no, it's their performance metric. They want to close a case. It's like you saying, I'm going to class and I'm not going to do the reading. I'm going to get an F so they could like demote me back to patrol. No, it's the big performance metric, but you have these compounding factors like the use of weapons that have an impact. Next study, I went back to my Newark homicide data set that I inherited from George Kelling and then finished it off. As a side note, I now have data for the city of Newark from 1984 to 2020, so June 2020 is the longest data set that I know of primary data collection. So what I wanted to do is look at what factors influence what are the case outcomes through the different systems. So we looked at what cases get dismissed. We looked at what cases get plea deals, what cases, when they go to trial, get an acquittal, and then once you are convicted, what impacts your sentence length. So in this case, again, it was great because I was able to work with, and this is little and I'll tell you all about it, but I was able to work with my colleagues in the New Jersey Department of Corrections, so I found out what was the outcome of all the cases, which is really hard data to get to, like whether somebody pleads and what's their plea deal and all that stuff. That's not something that's like really accessible. So just in a nutshell, what we were looking at, if you engaged in a crime with a firearm, your case had a higher likelihood of getting dismissed. However, if you made it through that and your case wasn't dismissed, you had a less likelihood of getting a plea deal. If you went to trial, you have a higher likelihood of getting convicted. And if you are convicted, you get a longer sentence than non-firearms. Some of it could be confounding because firearm is considered in a lot of states an aggravating factor. So when you look at it, especially in New Jersey, there was, that's one of the limitations we know, that like 2 years before we completed the data collection, a year or 2 years, they imposed mandatory sentences for if firearm was used. But this is a pattern that you see in a lot of states. Just I know in Texas and stuff, having a firearm to kill someone is going to make you at a higher angle. So the big takeaway from the case processing is firearms will make it more likely that you're going to get away with murder. But if you get caught, you are going to get maximum punishments. So again, because of the aggravating factors, and then with the case processing, the whole idea of resources is just a harder case to investigate as a police officer. So I was pretty much focused on this and doing a lot of this work till about 2020. In 2020, I had an opportunity, 2020, 2019, I had an opportunity to go off and I started working with public health, and I started working in a study with social workers. So I kind of like shift gears. For most of my career, I was either criminology or criminal justice, and then I got fortunate enough to get connected with different groups, and I shift into transdisciplinary. And what is transdisciplinary? I like the name because it sounds fancy and like you're doing something really important. But pretty much what transdisciplinary means, it transcends discipline. Unlike multidisciplinary or just unidisciplinary, what happens with transdisciplinary work is that you bring people together from different disciplines, and we pretty much meld our knowledge, right? We meld our knowledge. It's not about you're superior because you have crim theory or whatever you may have. It's like we all pretty much bring what we have, and we create our own structures and our own systems to investigate things. And on top of that, an important aspect of transdisciplinary work is that it involves people that are affected by it. So you're working with practitioners, you're going back and forth with them, asking them, like, what do you need? Like, what is your insight? You're bringing people in with lived experiences that can inform us. And one of my big problems I had with criminology before is like, especially as somebody that coming from Newark, I would always be like, you have these people that are studying crime, but they would not know a project if they walk by it. Or you have these people doing policing research, but they've never been in a cop car. Stuff like that, right? But that kind of changes with transdisciplinary because we bring people in that are involved in it. So in the past 5 years, I have been very busy with a study called the PAIR studies. The PAIR study is preventing and assessing risk for intimate partner homicide. This study is a replication. Who studies here intimate partner violence? So you probably have heard of the seminal 2003 Jackie Campbell study on the risk factors for intimate partner homicide. It's the study. Yeah, and that's how I got involved in this. Jackie Campbell calls, you drop everything that you have, and I was like, yes, Jackie, I will work with you. I was really happy. But anyway, so we were replicating her study with the PAIR study, but we are taking a different approach in that we build a transdisciplinary team. Our team is me, I'm the criminologist. We have a public health scholar, we have nursing, and we have social work. And we came together as a team to do this study, to replicate her original research, and to look at what are the risk factors for intimate partner homicide. Have they changed since she did her data collection in 1990s, which we suspect. And then we also are looking at like things that they were a thing, but they really weren't a thing, like same-sex couples. Or like some of the things in her risk factors would be like stalking. Did he call you and leave you a message in your answering machine? Stalking don't really happen like that anymore. He slip into your DMs and put a bad picture of you on Instagram. I don't know. So it's just different. So we started doing this study. We call it the PAIR study because we paired states with each other. And we looked at 2 criteria for pairing states. We looked at states that are very safe for women and are ranked as A or B states. And then we looked at the opposite side of the continuum, states that have been identified as not safe for women and are in the D to F continuum. We also paired states based on firearm laws, based on most restrictive to less restrictive, to see if that changes the dynamics. As you could see, Texas was one of our states. It's one of our states. And so we, with the help of Sam Houston at the time, we were able to collect a good chunk of all the intimate partner homicides that occurred in Texas through the help of LIMIT. I am unveiling the findings of this on November 20th when I'm giving a big presentation of the findings. But in a nutshell, did we see differences within states? Yes, right? First of all, firearms were more likely to use 75% of the time. States with more restrictive gun laws, there were less firearms. But one of the things that I found really interesting is that I found that in states with less restrictive firearm laws, more restrictive firearm laws, where there's not that much firearms, the homicides tended to be a little bit more brutal. We saw a lot more overkill. We saw a lot more stuff than just shooting your partner. I don't know if it's a fact. And I don't know, like the person is still dead, but like if how they get killed is going to be a big issue. We did find with help-seeking behavior that a lot of these, and it was mostly women, our sample is we ended up with like about 80% women. A lot of these women did seek help, and they didn't really get the help they needed from the criminal justice system. There were protective orders that weren't really implemented, so offenders that did use the firearm were more likely to have it unlocked, multiple in the home. So if you invite me back, I'll give you the full-blown pair study findings. So this is what I've been doing for the past 5 years. And I also started my own society. I helped co-found with a group of public health scholars and medicine scholars. We founded the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms. I know ideally I would have done a QR code, but I don't know how to do that. So you're just gonna have to do it the old-fashioned way and Google it. So that's what I tell my students now. It's like, can you Google it? They're looking at me like, is there a QR code? And I'm like, I don't know how to do that. Like, I'm a full professor. We lose those skills when we get to this point. So the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms is transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. It's right now pretty much about 50% of our people are public health and 20% are medicine. But we do have our straggler criminologists here and there. The goal of it is to create and to help foster the science of firearm injury prevention. This is not the big point of the presentation, but historically, if you know a little bit about history and funding, in 1992, there was a famous Dickey Amendment that was passed at the federal level that essentially forbid any research dollars to go into lobbying. And the idea was that a lot of the firearm research was going to be used to lobby against firearms in the United States. So it pretty much halted all firearm research, and the tides changed after Sandy Hook under President Obama, where there was a big push to name firearm violence a public health concern, and then that lifted. There was an amendment to that Dickey Amendment, and in 2020, research dollars started coming in. I had the honor and privilege to be in the first panel from the CDC that awarded the first grants, and after we finished doing it, I didn't really understand the significance of it, so everybody started clapping at the end like, oh my God, we have research money. And then from about 2020 to about 2022, $125 million worth of grants were awarded for firearm injury prevention. But because of the big gap, we call it, there was a lost generation of researchers. Because as you know, particularly if you're an assistant professor, you need to publish, you need money, you need grants, you need all that stuff. So we lost a generation of researchers. And the goal of the society is to build the new generation of researchers. We do a lot of work with students, we do a lot of mentoring, we do a lot of networking so that we can build this up. We have an annual conference that's coming up, November 19th to 21st. It's in Tempe. As of yesterday, we have 520 people coming. Usually we get between 500 and 800 people from all disciplines that their focus is firearm injury prevention, and we're building up a field. So that has kept me busy. But it taught me from coming from a criminology-centered approach to now a transdisciplinary-centered approach is that we need all hands on deck. And it's not a problem that is just a criminology problem. We need the public health people, we need the social workers, we need the engineers. Like, you're thinking, like, how do engineers have to do with firearms? But who do you think designs them? It's the engineers, right? You need people that do urban planning. So that's what we're trying to do here. And I went from advocating criminology, and I used to get into discussions with my husband who studied policing. I was like, you guys are atheoretical, you have no theory. And he would be like, well, I don't need theory. And I was like, yes, you do. Everybody needs theory. But to an approach where I see the value in what different disciplines bring to the table. And hopefully we could get criminologists to come to the fold. Criminologists are generally very prideful. They don't like to be told what to do. So big takeaway, transdisciplinary approaches to study firearm violence are essential. So I think, did I go over time? Okay, so that's what I have for you. Now is your shot to, no pun intended. No pun intended, this is your shot. And you could just yell out. Hi.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. And I might forget it, but like, what's your name?
Allison Conrad.
Okay.
My question was, with the evolution of like 3D printing and kind of these ghost guns that are being introduced, how do you think that this will evolve the research of firearms, but also firearm-related clearances, rates, etc.?
It's going to make it a lot harder, right? Because with the 3D printing, there's no serial number. So if it was hard before, it's going to be harder now. Ghost guns, it's new, right? There is literally no research out there. And it was named under the Biden administration a priority, but it is no longer a priority. And firearm violence is no longer a priority. For years, under the past two administrations, it got research money because it was named a public health concern, but the new MAHA report, the Make America Healthy report that came out this year, have removed. It's no longer a public health concern, even though almost 100,000 people get shot. But anyway, the point of the story is that we suspect that it's going to make things harder, particularly in the criminal justice system, but we just don't know because there has just not a lot of research. And I suspect this has been deprioritized. I know that the ATF is getting huge cuts.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of information,
It feels
but nobody
weird to
knows
thank
about
you
them.
for that, but you
Yeah.
know, the doom and gloom. But
Yeah, we don't know. Anything else? You can yell it out. Oh, you need your mic. Okay. Oh, that's right.
Makes me feel
forget
heard.
about that.
So I know when it comes to murder, men tend to use guns a lot more, and women tend to use knives. And I'm pretty sure just the general availability within the home leads to knives being used, because most murders by women are done in their houses. But what I'm interested in is the states with heavy gun laws. had more overkill whenever murder was done, correct?
When there were more knives.
Say
And so the gays, and I'm sorry if I just misspoke. So the more restrictive states, like
Yeah.
I would say like New Jersey, we had higher percent. Actually, let me, because it's complicated. They had a significant less number of murder and women, right? So during our 6-year period, for example, when you standardize it by population, like Texas blew everybody out of the map, versus New Jersey, it was just a smaller number. But in places like New Jersey, guns and beatings were more often used, and in those cases, there was a lot more overkill.
Okay, so the question around that surrounds is the fact that, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. Does the gender bias of men using guns a lot more lead to that overkill? And or with the increasing of restriction on guns, does that overkill move towards other forms of violence?
I mean, like, I don't know. I do know men are more likely to use firearms. Men are more likely to use firearms against men, and men are more likely to use a firearm against women. So we do have that men thing, and when women are killed in domestic context, they're more likely to be killed with a firearm. The overkill thing, I don't know. I know this is something that we're going to have to explore. We haven't gotten to that point yet. And then I think the bigger question with the overkill is something that it's actually not studied much. And I know now because one of my students is writing her master's thesis on overkill. But even though we're seeing more overkill in states with more restrictive gun laws, they still have less women getting killed. So I don't, but yeah, and I think your question would be something that would be interesting to examine, but there's just not a lot of overkill research. Because for you to do overkill research, you pretty much need data, most likely from the MEOs, because it'll tell you, I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of reading autopsy reports, but they draw a diagram and it tells you, like, how many times was the person stabbed? How many times were they probably punched and all that stuff? So that's how you generally like measure it. So it's not that popular, at least in criminology. Maybe in psychology there's more work, but my student who's writing her thesis hasn't found a lot of research for her lit review. And maybe you guys could tell your department chair and your dean to fund you to go to the National Research Conference. We do have an awesome mentoring breakfast. We have a happy hour for students and early career where the adults are not allowed in. So I pay for it, and then I can't go and have a drink with them because they want to feel free to be themselves. That's what they told me. Without an adult in the room checking them out. Last year I was peeking. I was like, what are they doing there? Supposedly they were playing bingo, but whatever. But I wasn't invited.
Hello, Dr. Pizarro.
Hi.
Thank you for talking to us. I have a question about working with other researchers or practitioners in your transdisciplinary research. Have there been anything that was really eye-opening for you that you learned from people from other disciplines?
Yeah. That there is a whole world outside of criminology of people that are doing incredible work I was surprised because I came in to this and I would be like, well, we need to know this. And then it was like, there's just an amazing world out there with really good research. And I would argue, like, don't kick me out of the School of Criminal Justice, but I will argue that in this day, the best violence research is not coming from criminology. It's coming from social work, and it's coming from public health. Even though they're atheoretical and we could like have a fight over that, and criminologists, but if you want to know what's happening in the field, you don't go to criminology, you go to the journal social work. So I was open, I was amazed with, not to badmouth our field, with how short-sighted we are. And I was like, oh my goodness, there's a whole world on like survivorship. Because as a criminologist, it ended with courts. And that was it, right? And there's a whole bunch of people that are looking at the aftermath. If you're interested about this, Tanya Sharp, who is an amazing scholar, she's probably my favorite scholar until 2025, Tanya Sharp. She's at Social Work University of Toronto. She did a special issue for me in my in homicide study on the aftermath of homicide. And what I've learned from people like the social workers is that it doesn't end with a conviction. If you want to really decrease homicide, and if you really want to get decreased violence, you have to do a lot of work with the people that are left behind. I think I've mentioned this in my presentation. For every suicide, the statistics show that 33 people are affected by one suicide when you multiply that by the total number of people. When there's a homicide, you have immediate family members that are affected, but you have people in the community. You have children that walk through that street to go to school, and it creates this trauma that then leads to more violence. So that was one of the things that I've been humbled, and I feel very privileged to be exposed to people that do that. And I also I was a staunch criminologist, right? I'm thinking everything is like call the police, right? But I've been humbled by knowing that there are things outside of criminology that are significantly effective or more effective than relying on police-centered responses. So that's my long-winded answer. So if you are interested in violence, expand your horizons. Go read the social work journals. Go read the public health journal. Go read the medicine journals. Although sometimes I get a little ornery. I had a situation not so long ago. We were evaluating research papers for a prestigious award, and it was a public health journal, and it was a really good paper. It was about like redlining, and all the medical people was like, this is like so innovative. And of course, I live in both worlds, and I was like, this is not innovative. Sean McKay found that in 1950. And everybody's like, oh, I kind of like killed that award. But I was like, yeah, Sean McKay, we've been doing this in criminology since 1950, but you know what? We haven't really been very good at promoting it. So I busted their bubble, and not everybody was mad at me because I was like, that's not innovative. I kind of blurted it out by mistake. Yeah. Anything else?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for
I just
having
wanted
me.
to ask you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you. You mentioned how just the fact that they carried a gun with them or like a firearm escalated the crime, and I just wanted to know how you measure that.
We measure that because, so one of the things we did, and I know it's not a perfect measure outside of, like the best measure would have been to talk to people, but we, in the NORG data set, for that particular study, but we also saw this in the NORG data set, we had access to the entire case investigation report, which it will tell you, and in a lot of cases you get the prosecutor stuff, especially if a case goes to trial, you get like a really nice thick report of how this case is going to be tried. And the pre-sentence investigation reports have a lot of that information in the incident report, so we extrapolated whether you were going there to, was it spontaneous? So there would be like, such and such was going to the chicken joint or to pick up his laundry. And then, according to witnesses, such and such looked at him crooked. And he was like, what you looking at? And now they're like arguing with each other. So there was no indication in the case files that they were going there with an explicit intent. The problem when we started doing with the homicide data, which was a major limitation, was that everybody was dead. And we were able to get to more of that data with the sample of full, the all violent offenders. And we extrapolated that from all those reports. Not reported here, but Kristen Segovia has published on the data with the interviews. So they interviewed 400. They ended up interviewing 400 violent offenders. Actually, she's doing a special issue for me on the second aftermath. So I did one aftermath homicide from the victim side. Kristen Segovia is doing an aftermath homicide from the offender perspective and looking at what happens to them in prison. And she is publishing in that special issue that's not coming out till February 2027 about the interviews with the offenders. But yeah, not a perfect measure at all. We kind of like coded it based on what we read in the files. Yep.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have kind of more of a selfish question. Have you considered looking at youth who carry handguns?
It's most of the research on youth, most of the research on firearm carriage, there's a lot of research on youth. It's in the public health perspective. I actually have a paper with a group of public health scholars. It was a scope and review of firearm youth carrying, and it's Schmidt et al. I think it's Schmidt et al. 2020, 2021, where we looked at it. Youth work it's very popular in the public health world. So we did this scope and review where we looked at all the research. There was a little bit, I think we ended up including only 2 CJ studies because they were the only ones that met the criteria for inclusion. But there is that. Yeah. But youth are important. I mean, it's the #1 killer for them. So we want to keep them. Thank you. You're welcome.